Christoper Mulder. He is a lieutenant colonel. He is a senior U.S. Air Force fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, and a former Joint Staff Requirements Officer. Mr. Mulder is a command pilot with more than 2,600 hours in the F-16 and T-6, including 270 combat hours. He served as the 80th Operations Group Deputy Commander, responsible for assisting in leading operations for the Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training Program. In addition, Lieutenant Colonel Mulder instructed and trained new pilots from 14 nations, including Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And we also have here Mark Massa. Mark is an assistant director in forward defense within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. Mark contributes to programs and research on nuclear, space, and homeland security. He is a second-year MA candidate in the Security Studies program at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Hi, Christoper, and hi, Mark. How are you?
Good, thanks, Leo, and thanks to Lee, who unfortunately dropped off, for the generous introduction. Mark Massa and I are delighted to be here at this event. Thank you for inviting us and allowing us to present our space strategy paper that we unveiled on 12 April, International Human Spaceflight Day. Today is Cinco de Mayo, so happy Cinco de Mayo. And also another reason to celebrate today, and I don't know if this was previously mentioned, but it's the 60th anniversary of the first American in space, Alan Sheppard. So that's today, 60th anniversary of that. So a lot of things to celebrate and to be proud of. And we're delighted to present our presentation. On 12 April, when we rolled out our paper, we also presented a video that we would like to play at this time because I think it sets the stage and it's very, very visionary. And thanks to Julia Siegel and Clementine Starling, a couple of our other co-authors, for helping with that video. So Leo, I'm going to take over here and share my screen.
For centuries, humankind gazed up at the night skies, pondering life's unsolved mysteries. From the first person orbiting Earth to Neil Armstrong's pioneering steps on the moon.
3, 2, 1.
Space has been at the forefront of our advancement.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground.
From agriculture, navigation, science to economics, life on Earth is guided by progress in space. Thousands of satellites act as eyes, ears, and beacons in the skies. Around the world, countries and companies launch space programs to explore new frontiers, further civilization, and dive deeper into our universe. We have the tools and resources to explore even further. But we lack a strategy to get there. Unfortunately, space governance has not kept pace with these groundbreaking developments. But if we act now, we can protect the galaxy for future exploration and push the envelope of possibility. Securing space is the key to advancing life on Earth. The U.S. and its allies are on the precipice of shaping a new tomorrow.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the sands of past life.
Here at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, we share a vision for harmony in the space domain as we redefine how to advance space activity, who holds the key, and how far our explorations can go. We've developed a roadmap for security in space over the next 30 years, ensuring universal internet and developing keystone technologies over the next decade, facilitating rocket transportation between different points on Earth and routinized activity in cislunar space, and establishing a new international space treaty and a security alliance for space. This vision for 2050 is only in the stars if space visionaries act today.
Well, while this is loading, thank you so much for the kind introduction. My name is Mark Massa, and Chris and I are here from the Atlantic Council. It's a Washington, D.C. based think tank, a nonpartisan, nonprofit institution. Can folks see my screen just fine?
That's good, Mark.
Great. Nonpartisan nonprofit institution. Chris and I hail from the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, which honors the legacy of the late General Brent Scowcroft, two-time national security advisor, really a visionary who is committed, and we're committed to honoring his legacy of sustainable, nonpartisan strategies. And our most elevated platform for putting forward these strategies is the Atlantic Council Strategy Paper Series. About a year ago, we just set forth to put out a 30-year space strategy, thinking that we needed to push the foreign policy and national security communities to understand space through a long-term lens and the great possibilities that it offers. We are very fortunate to have this effort co-chaired by two Atlantic Council board directors, former Secretary of the United States Air Force, Deborah Lee James, and former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General James Cartwright. Their vision was instrumental for us pushing this paper forward. And as Chris mentioned earlier, we're very grateful to our two co-authors who couldn't join us today, Clementine Starling and Julia Siegel, who are with us in the Forward Defense Initiative. We were inspired to write our paper on space issues due to 5 important developments that we saw in space. I'm sure that they're no news to the people on this conference, but just briefly, we were inspired by really the boundless potential that space offers over the coming years and decades for addressing some of humanity's most pressing challenges. General Cartwright convinced us that space is on the cusp of a major transition to being a domain where primarily we're engaged in exploration and scientific efforts to being a domain where truly a large portion of humanity's economy occurs, and where security interests of the assets in space are just as important as the support services they give to Earth. Third, we were concerned about growing risks to security in space, both from great power competition with China and Russia, and also from the growing threat of debris, orbital debris to US and allied assets and truly global access to space. Next, we found that many in the space community, as I'm sure many of you here, are getting very excited about the possibilities of cislunar space for commercial applications, for national security applications. And we saw there was a real disconnect with the foreign policy community, not quite understanding even what this was, a lot of vocabulary explaining to do. So that's something that we highlighted in this. And finally, the growing concern of the more sophisticated anti-satellite weapons operated by the United States is great power rivals and increasingly smaller rogue actors and even potentially non-state actors. I'll turn it over to Chris now to discuss the major elements of our strategy.
All right, thanks, Mark, for laying some of the context there. To build upon that, General Scowcroft, he always, when he built strategy, he would always put out the goals, and then you would lay out how are you going to reach the goals. So that's how we approached this paper. We had a template that was given to us by Mr. Hadley, another former national security advisor. And the template really helped us think through this 30-year strategy. In 1981, I was a young boy. That's the first launch of the space shuttle. In the last 41 years, that time has flown by. And so it really reminds me that what we do today, the planning, the vision, that time will go extremely quick, but the planning is very, very important. And so that's pretty much what the strategy paper is. It's a short, medium, and long-term plan to meet the vision of the future. And our vision is we want the space domain to remain harmonious, fully accessible, organized, and regulated. So humankind can reap the benefits of space resources that we've heard a lot about in this conference in perpetuity. So that's the vision. The 3 goals that we lay out before we get to the elements: promote stability and establish a rules-based order, deter hostile action, and foster U.S. and global prosperity through the expansion of space commerce, which are all in line with the developments that Mark discussed. So the 4 elements that are nested underneath the vision and the goals. The first one is to relook at the treaties. All the treaties, there's 5 foundational treaties. They were all created and coordinated and agreed upon very early on in the space race. We believe they're outdated and they could be renegotiated in due time. The second one is we need to defend space for US and allied prosperity against the great competitors, China, Russia, and others. The third element is accelerating space commerce that's critical for space development through clear regulation and targeted investment, and we'll talk about some of the recommendations shortly. The fourth element is, as Mark mentioned, we believe that the future is in cislunar space. That's where the resources are located, and that's where the competition will be won or lost. Next slide, Mark. And from the elements, we've derived 4 principal recommendations. And as mentioned, we have short, medium, and long-term actions that need to be taken to fulfill the strategy. In the short term, we're looking between now and 2025. In the medium term, we're looking 2025 to 2040. And in the long term, we're looking 2040 to 2050. In line with that first element, redefining the legal or regulatory frameworks, we believe that the current president could appoint a special presidential envoy for space. What that would do, it would be another arm from the National Space Council, which we're very grateful that the current administration is going to continue under the leadership of Vice President Harris. But that special presidential envoy for space will be able to communicate at a governmental executive office level with other nations and start the conversation on updating some of the outdated treaties. In the medium term, we've already started it with the Artemis Accords, where those principles, as more nations start to sign on to those Artemis Accords, they're a little bit more updated. We believe that will help continue with this customary international law, which will then feed into a new treaty in that long term. The second principal recommendation that we discuss is establishing a security alliance for space. As I'm sure you know, General Raymond, the Chief Space Force operator, has called space the Wild Wild West. And there's a lot of unknowns with, who can launch the satellites, where the satellites will be positioned. There was a recent close call, I think it was last week or the week before, but, will people get fines? Will you get a ticket if you break, some of these norms and laws? And so we believe that NATO can be a foundation, at least to take a look at, pull the partners together, pull the allies together to start having those discussions. And in the medium term, continued bi and multilateral efforts to create this alliance. We acknowledge it will take time to do this. And in the long term, no kidding, finalize and create the alliance that perpetuates the norms and the laws that we need in space, so we can all take advantage of the resources that we're talking about during this conference. So Mark, over to you to talk about the last 2 principal recommendations.
Thanks, Chris. Our third principal recommendation was to accelerate space commerce through clear regulation and targeted investment. Part of the clear regulation comes from the National Space Council, one of their many goals is to, or can be, to coordinate regulations across the interagency. As many of you know, plenty of different departments and agencies in the US federal government, from the Federal Aviation Administration to the Federal Communications Commission to the Department of Commerce, and of course NASA and the Space Force all have stakes in funding and regulating space. So it's important for there to be a body like the National Space Council to help streamline these regulations, which in our discussions with people involved in the space industry often found to be overly burdensome or even at times contradictory, difficult to comply with, all of them at the same time. So we believe that in the short term, the US government can work to resolve some of those. We also recommended investment in what we called keystone space technologies. So those are those technologies with positive externalities for the entire space industrial base. Perhaps space solar power is one of them. And one of the key principles that we set out is that where possible, the government shouldn't set out a specific technology that it wants to invest in, but rather set out the requirement that it has and let industry, to the extent possible, put forward ideas to solve the problem in new and creative ways, in a way that many industry representatives didn't feel that they were being treated at the moment. In the medium term, one of our recommendations was to work to spread the space economy across the United States, including by incentivizing state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to participate in the space economy, even more so than they already do, through leasing public lands for spaceports and other infrastructure, and increasing grants at the state university level for space development. And in the long term, what we were interested in was a space industrial base that can support diverse launch platforms, in situ resource utilization on the moon and perhaps beyond, and really a thriving space industrial base that encompasses cislunar space. Which brings us to our next development on taking a cislunar approach to space development. As I said earlier, one of the parts of this goal is simply to get people outside of the space community, but in the foreign policy and national security communities talking about cislunar space, like the important area that we now know that it is, having done this research. We believe that NASA should, of course, continue its exploration of the moon, including through the Artemis program. The current administration, I understand, is reviewing the timeline for that. Whatever decision they come out on, we hope that the program continues. In the medium term, there are quite a few national security applications, possibly of cislunar space. Most importantly and pressingly would be extending space situational awareness to cislunar space, and figuring out which commercial and security applications are best suited for that region. Finally, we were quite interested in Lagrange points and thought that a national strategy towards potentially developing infrastructure at these points were the most useful ones, or figuring out a way to incorporate them into the alliance and treaty we propose should be a goal for the United States. Those were our principal recommendations. There's quite a few more in the report. Thank you to whoever dropped the link in the chat. I encourage you to go ahead and read it on our website. We did this strategy. It goes out 30 years, but what the heck does any of this have to do with space solar power? We didn't mention space solar power in the report. Perhaps we would have if we had heard these great presentations before we went final. But the point of our strategy is that the United States and its allies, in close coordination with its allies and partners, needs to take a 30-year approach to space or longer. A long-term vision of space will allow us to make long-term investments, long-term decisions, and will allow us to develop some of the policy and legal regimes that will make activities like space solar power possible. This includes, protection of activities such as space solar power, but many more activities through that could occur in space through treaties to make sure that they're legal and permissible, regulations for how they might be taxed and regulated. Infrastructure in the space industrial base will benefit all users of space, and as well as targeted investment, making sure there's a positive human capital base in the United States and in allied countries to support these sorts of developments in a way that some have assessed as lacking at the moment, and a clear governance regime in the United States itself to make sure that space gets the priority it deserves at the national level and attention from senior policymakers in the White House, in the various departments, on Capitol Hill, at the state level, and elsewhere. So in conclusion, there's quite a few very exciting applications of space, like space solar power, and the point of our strategy is to bring these applications and the need for a long-term strategy to the attention of the folks in the Atlantic Council's network to really promote a vision of space that can be secured and that can bring long-term security and prosperity to the United States and our allies and partners. Chris, unless you have anything to add, I think we'd be more than happy to hear any questions.
No, thanks, Mark. And yeah, we'll take questions at this time.
All right. So can you all hear me?
Yes, Lee.
Sorry, I dropped off in the middle of your intros. I have a backup now, so hopefully won't get any more interruptions. Can you talk a little bit about, where our focus here, our conversations is closer to the front end of your short-term time frame there. So can you talk a little bit about the key turning points and how a public-private partnership through the Space Act Corporation would contribute to your short and long-term goals?
Sure, Mark, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, of course. So one of our core recommendations is that the U.S. government needs to take space a lot more seriously than it does now. It needs to understand that there's long-term potentials for space development, and it needs to think about and invest with a long-term lens. So whether through the Space Act Corporation or other means, we're very pleased to see the reestablishment or the continued establishment of the National Space Council. We hope to see something like the Users Advisory Group also considered, so that the national space policy makers can get input from industry to streamline regulation and come up with partnerships that are conducive to the sort of relationships that we need to make these applications possible. And as we're taking this paper on the road to conferences like this and discussions with policymakers, those are some of the points that we are emphasizing that we heard all the time from people in the space industrial base, from new space companies, from people in small business. In fact, one of our recommendations is that the Biden administration consider adding the Small Business Administrator to the National Space Council, given all of the really exciting small businesses that we spoke to, and the need to incorporate them more fully and thoroughly into the space industrial base. Especially, we recognize in our report that the U.S. government will be the anchor tenant for many of these applications. We were just talking about, the government being an anchor tenant for space-based solar power, which could eventually create a market that other applications could fill. So, understanding that, using government contracting and other resources to bring small businesses into U.S. government space efforts. How about a special space office within the Small Business Administration?
Yeah.
Peter, why not? I wish I could go back and add that as a subject in our recommendation. So those are some of the ideas we had in our report.
Our isn't our leader Tim Chrisman, isn't he on the National Small Business Administration? Or a similar organization?
Very different kind of organization, Lee. Chris, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that AFWorks, SpaceWorks, DIU, those are all, public-private like partnerships that are getting after what I think will help in the short term, get through some of the legacy acquisition rules, inspire companies to partner, with the services to get after some of the capabilities that will advance the space domain.
Chris, one of our other recommendations coming out of this report relating to the U.S. government's relation with space companies is considering adding space systems as a 17th critical infrastructure sector. For those of you who aren't aware, the Department of Homeland Security helps oversee the critical infrastructure program, where currently there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Space is covered through a lot of them, but it's a little bit disparate at the moment. For instance, there's a manufacturing sector that covers aerospace, communication handles a lot of it. And we came across people who thought that unifying these into a space critical infrastructure sector could help clarify the relations. An interesting question is which, for each critical infrastructure sector currently has one or more sector specific agencies. So that's an agency of the US government that decides to work with the sector. Sometimes there's more than one per sector. And understanding, just to emphasize the disparate nature of, thanks Michael for posting that link, to emphasize the disparate nature of who works with space. It's unclear which agency would it maybe be the Office of Space Commerce within the Department of Commerce or others. So interesting to consider, and one of the recommendations in our report.
Great. And then can you just briefly address, now that you've heard all these presentations about space-based solar, I think I'm frozen again.
We can still hear you.
Yeah.
We're good.
Now that you've heard all these, talk a little bit about whether that will find its way into your next draft as you move forward.
Well, I was jealous watching Colonel Felt because I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it looked like he was sitting in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I love the food. Green chili is my favorite. But based off of his presentation and how it sounds like the Space Force and the Air Force are pursuing that technology, I don't see why we would not, consider it in future drafts.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris and Mark, for being here today. Look forward to seeing your work going forward.
Thanks so much for inviting us. We certainly learned a lot.
Appreciate it.